All right. Hello and welcome to the 7th session in the Dance Talk series. Our guest today is the world-famous Pierre Dillenbourg. He's a full professor at EPFL in Lausanne and leads the Computer-Human Interaction Lab for Learning and Instruction. And today he's going to talk about orchestration graphs. And Carolyn, why don't you introduce the topic of Pierre's talk?
Okay, well, we're extremely excited to have Pierre here to speak to us. I've known Pierre now for about 10 years, and he's been a thought leader in the field of CSCL really since its inception and continues to be extremely active in shaping the vision and progress of that community. And what I've always admired about his work is there's always something very creative about it, sometimes extremely simple but creative that nobody else would have thought of, but not always simple. And he just has a way of having these ideas that only with some technical expertise, which his group is also strong in, can these things be carried out. And so he's a great balance of things, technical and yet not always just doing complicated things for their own sake, looking for the opportunity to show where the value in that skill comes. And over the summer, when I was visiting Dragan Geshevich's lab in Edinburgh, he passed on to me a copy of Pierre's book on orchestration graphs, and as I was reading it, I thought how valuable his perspective would be for this dance community, because many of the issues that he was thinking of about design from a computational perspective were exactly the kind of approach that we have been trying to take in our own development work in this dance community. So I thought it would be very beneficial. Also, Pierre's group more and more has been taking a very leading, cutting-edge role in the growth of the MOOC movement. And so he not only has the theoretical and technical background to really speak into this community, but he's really pushing this community forward. And so we're extremely lucky to have him here today, and I'm also extremely glad that it's being recorded, so not only the people who are able to be here synchronously, but others who come later will be able to benefit from this. So let's all give Pierre our full attention, and without further ado, I'll pass it on to Pierre.
Merci, Caroline. Good evening or good morning. Olivier, how do I know do you know if there is somebody online, or are we alone? Do you have any clue?
We have a couple of viewers right now in the Hangout. So far it's 4, but it's usually increasing. Now it's 5, increasing in the first couple of minutes.
Okay. So it's a bit strange it's like a MOOC, to speak to people that you have no clue who is watching you. So yes, you are here actually in the MOOC factory. This is the place where we are recording. One of the places where we are recording the EPFL MOOC. Produced 37 in the pipe, and we've got 1 million MOOC registration so far. So we are very active in the MOOC. But that's not the topic of the day. Topic of the day, well, it's some way. The topic of the day came from the idea that, you know, if you do a MOOC, you have to simplify pedagogy, because the kind of things we do in CSCL, the more advanced pedagogical scenario. Let me share my screen. The more check, not this way. Hop. Un écran. Olivier, do you see my PowerPoint?
Perfect.
Okay. So the reason why this orchestration graph connect to MOOCs is expressed by this graph. This graph represents an hypothesis that is widespread in the MOOC discussion, is that if you have 10 or 100 or 20 or 50 students, you can do very rich pedagogy. Olivier, do you see my cursor? My pointer?
I can't see the pointer. No. Oh, no, I can see it. I can see it. It's a bit small, but I can see it. Yes.
Maybe it's passing. So if you have a low scale, you can have a very rich pedagogical approach. But if you want to scale up to 10,000, 20 students or more, you have to sacrifice the pedagogical richness. You cannot do open problem solving or use simulation. You need to go into more directive approach, such as video lectures and quizzes. And the hypothesis behind the orchestration graph is that if you translate this scenario, this rich pedagogical approach, into a formal model, then you might be able to scale them up. Okay. Peer grading is an example. Peer grading is something you can do with small classes, but because you have a peer grading algorithm, you can apply peer grading with 1 million students, or let's say 10,000 students. So that's the idea. Those of you who know quite well the most advanced pedagogical approaches, basically there are two approaches. One is the approach of George Siemens. You know, if you want to have this rich pedagogical environment, then you build more or less on emergence of knowledge among the participants of a MOOC. You let them interact in a very free way, sometimes a bit chaotic, but interesting, engaging, and from this kind of magma, some knowledge will emerge for the community. That's one approach, with some empirical evidence, like all the work of Manu Kapoor on productive failure, even though it's not the same scale. Now, on the other hand, I'm a school teacher. I used to be elementary school teacher, so I like, rather, instead of this magma, I like to design. So what I will show you today is some kind of approach to instructional design in which we formalize instructional design to be able to scale it up. You will feel that I have some German influence, a kind of controlling what's going on. So let's start with a concrete example. Imagine that this is a MOOC on geology. And at some point, the professor says, oh, I would like you to upload 3 pictures of soil erosion. Okay, and just go ahead. That's your assignment for next week. Go around your house and take 3 pictures. So people take pictures, and if you have, let's say, 20,000 students, you get 60,000 pictures. Okay. Then, of course, half of them are black picture, a blurred picture, a bad picture. So you automatically filter out this picture, and you get 30,000 more or less okay pictures. Fine. What do you do with that? If you are a teacher, you get 30,000 pictures. You're not going to spend all your holidays watching these pictures. So that's not so useful. It's okay, but it's not useful. But you have 20,000 students online. So what you can do is you take randomly 2 pictures. You send them to a student or a pair of students, and you ask them, is it erosion of type A or erosion of type B? And which one of these 2 pictures is the best? Then automatically the algorithm can filter this, and you have 3 stacks: the picture that are classified by everybody as type A, by everybody as type B, and those who are not clear that you can immediately forget about, eliminate. So we have the blue stack, the red stack, and now because you asked every time which one is the best, you can select the top 5% pictures, and this produces a very, very rich learning material, 1,000 high-quality pictures that you can integrate in your next lecture or whatever. Okay, that's an example of participation MOOC, but you understand it's not participation in the way that George Siemens designed it as a more very open environment. It's more participation with a kind of workflow behind it. So let's take these activities, and there has been first a lesson on geology, and then the different activities I described, including some lectures. And what you can do is you can say, or let's position them in time from left to the right, the different activities I described. And then you could say, well, some of these activities have been done individually, some of them have been done in class. So the vertical axis represent what Vygotsky called the planes, the social planes. For Vygotsky, there is this inter-individual plane, which is personal cognition, and the social plane, where cognition is shaped by culture. And I rename here, there is the individual plane, activities done individually, the class plane, activity done in class. And you could have in between team activities, like the picture comparison could be done in teams. So that's the first approach of what is an orchestration graph, is a sequence of activities positioned on 3 social planes. You can have 3 more planes. One is a periphery plane, like when you engage not only the class members, but also the some parents, some other classes from another country with whom you communicate, some the school director, or other members of the class, of the system, people with a login. So they have a permanent identity. Then the next level, you can involve the community people, like the butcher that comes to explain his job, the museum guardian that comes for that accompanies the school visit, and so these are, you can involve in some activities, right? Like a field trip, museum visit, and so on. And finally, you have the rest of the web, like when you put some in an activity where you would put a questionnaire online and you would expect people to vote or something like that. So these 6 layers define social layers. I don't call them layers or levels because it's a bit confusing, but planes because it's a word that we don't use that often in education, and that was used by Vygotsky. They are defined in an arbitrary way. I define them like that. I mean, it would not change anything if you decide to segment the world in 7 or 3 or 4 planes. What I mean by the class is a set of people participating into this pedagogical scenario. It can be a class of 20 students in a classroom or a class of 20,000 students in a MOOC. Okay. Now, in the story, the scenario that I described, there were 2 other things. One was to eliminate automatically bad picture. Another one was to select the top pictures. And these are what we call, in the graph, what we call operators. So they are not activities of the learner, but are things which are managed automatically. Like the first operator was to distribute randomly 2 pictures to was to build a stack, aggregate all the pictures. The second one was to distribute them. The third one was to classify them and then to sort them in the best. So this scenario can be scaled up with 10,000 people because some of the operations are managed automatically by bits of algorithms that we call operators. Okay. If it was in a class with 10 students, it would be collecting and distributed physical sheets of paper. If you are in a MOOC with 20,000, it's about workflow, about taking data from one activity and feeding data for the next activity. So what is an orchestration graph at this point? Is a weighted directed geometry graph. So we have activities connected by edges, and these edges embed operators, but also many other information that we will see in the rest of this talk. It's geometric because there is a north and a south. It's not an arbitrary order. There is a broad planes and smaller planes. It's directed because one activity comes before another one, and it's weighted because the edges will be associated with some probability values. So let me describe another graph that I use a lot in my teaching. It's about collaborative learning. When you do team argumentation, it occurs by chance that some teams argue very well, but many of the team will have no difference of viewpoint. So can you design a collaborative learning scenario where you make sure that there is some conflict between people, or at least you increase the probability that there will be some conflicts or some argumentation, explanations, justification. This mechanism triggers learning. So in this scenario, first there is an individual activity where we present 10 questions. There is no right or wrong answer. Every student can have his own opinion. Every answer reflects different opinions that can be more or less ranked on 2 axes. And this is a fictitious example, but I use it in my own teaching. Olivier, is it still on?
Yes, it's still on.
Okay, good. First activity. Based on these activities, because every answer has a value in terms of opinion. So we will try to build a map of the opinion on this class, and for each answer, the teacher decided to have different values associated to these answers. And on this basis, I can plot the students on a graph. And because it was about the use of drug in sport, whether the people are more tolerant about it or very strict about it, whether the reason to be strict is more for moral reason, like drugs is cheating, or for health reason, drugs is bad for sport people. Okay, this is not serious, and this is just a map of the opinion of the students who participate into this activity. And remember that the goal is to create conflict. So what the system does is it pairs automatically students with opposite opinion. So it partitioned the class into pairs with opposite opinion, and then we move to the team level, and then the students have to answer again the same questionnaire, but with somebody who disagreed with them. And at that moment, when it is done in a room, when this argumentation is done in a room, you feel the social cognitive conflict. You hear the noise level will reflect that. When this is done, then the system collects all answers, and there is a lecture based on the answer defined in the individual phase and in the collective, in the collaborative phase. So it's a kind of lecture, but built on the fly, like you could do with clickers. And finally, that to write an individual summary of the system has collected all the justification entered in the tool by the participants, and you based on this synthesis done by the system, the learners had to do a summary. Okay, so this pedagogical scenario can be represented this one. There is a part of the picture missing, sorry. So first an argumentation activity, and then plotting people on the map, computing the sum of the opinions, and then producing the map. From the map, we make pairs of opposite opinions. This is an operator to partition the class into pairs with opposite opinion. Then they were arguing, and then the system was aggregating all the answers to produce a debriefing slide. And finally, all the answers were sorted by question so that they could write an individual summary. So we have, in this pedagogical scenario that we call also collaboration script, we had a sequence of activities connected by operators. Okay, so then you get the basic idea of what is an orchestration graph. It does not describe how people learn. It describes the way that the pedagogical scenario is organized. It describes the time and social structure of learning and teaching activities. So it describes the management, the logistic, the orchestration of a pedagogical scenario. Now, this is the basic idea. I will now go through these 5 chapters, the semantics, mechanics, stochastic analytics, and cybernetics of this graph. So a graph is made of 2 sets, a set of vertices, which are the learning activities. They have a starting time, an ending time, a social plane, an object and a product, and they have traces that will produce the analytics. I do not review all the points here. And then a certain of edges. Edges connects 2 activities, AI and AJ, and they are associated with operators. I mentioned that. With controls, like if you want to make a loop or a branch, that's quite obvious. A label, which is what is the ID between this edge? Why is this activity coming before that one? It's called the label of an edge. And then there will be the weight associated to an edge. Is this activity 1 really necessary for activity 2? Then there is a strong weight to this edge, or it's kind of not much necessary, then there will be a low weight. And then there is a notion of elasticity. How much can you stretch this edge? I will come to this point later on. Let's start with the semantics. Why is an activity necessary before the next one? Oh, one option is because activity 1 is a prerequisite to activity 2. Quite obvious. Because activity 1 needs to bring the learner in the zone of proximal development for activity 2, ZPD. Or because this activity 1 provides advanced organizer for activity 2, or because activity 1 provides motivation for activity 2, or logistics, because you need to move the chairs before to start to do teamwork. So activity 1, moving the chairs, is just in terms of organization necessary to activity 2. Now you can have another kind of relationship that one activity is a set, a subset, or surset. I don't know how do you say that. Higher set than the next activity. So you will learn 2 skills, activity 1 and 2, and then you will aggregate it into a higher order skills in activity 3, or you will decompose it, and so on. You can have an activity that teach something in a declarative way, A1, and A2 ask them to translate that into procedural skills. This is a proceduralization edge. Elicitation is the other way around. Alternate is that you teach an activity, you have an activity with certain mode of representation, and then in the next activity you change the mode of representation. We know that multiple modes of representation enhance learning, and so on. And then you have other types of edges, such as activity 1, you show example, and then activity 2, you ask them to infer the definition of the concept. This is an inductive edge. Or the other way around, activity 1, you give the definition, and activity 2, you ask to classify example, and so on and so on. So so this graph seems like a semanticless graph. Now we bring semantics. The edges of on this graph mean something. There is an ID. The designer has an ID. Why does it put this activity before that one? There is a pedagogical ID behind, and this ID is embedded in the label that you associate to this edge. Here I just expressed 28 labels, but this is not an exhaustive classification of pedagogical ID. You can have many more. Just to show that with this variety of edges, you can actually invent a very broad set of pedagogical scenarios. Now you get the semantics. Let's go to the mechanics. As I mentioned, to scale this scenario with 10,000 or 1,000 students, you need to automate some processes. And like in the argumentation, you add an aggregation link. So you here visualization. You take all the answers from individuals and you build a map of it. You take data from one plane and you aggregate this data into data from the higher plane. You can have the imposite links. You take data from a higher plane and you distribute them at lower plane. For instance, the splitting one, you have data for the team, and then you split them into 2 subsets of data. Some of them that give evidence of A, evidence of B, and in this way you will do what we call a jigsaw script. A social operator, it takes the input from one activity and it produces the team structure for the next activity. You have group formation, as you have seen in the argumentation script I showed. You have things like role assignment, role rotation, like you ask people to rotate role from one activity to the next one. So the activity 2 can be the same as on 1, but the edge, between them, the system will have to redistribute the roles. Dropout management is another one, and so on. And then you have some back office operators in a pedagogical scenario, like detecting plagiarism, like, I don't know, they made something and you produce a rendering, you translate in a new language, you convert in different units, depending on what you do, and so on and so on. So an operator sounds very technical. You take data from one activity and they feed in the data for the next activity. But actually, you have a very broad range. Again, this is not exhaustive, very broad. We are only limited by our imagination. We have a very broad set of possible operators that can imagine. If you combine these 28 edges, labels, pedagogical ideas with these 20-something operators, you can imagine a huge set of learning scenarios. That is the mechanics. How do you run the scenario, the graph? But one key point here is that these operators, they sound like as boring technology. Nothing sounds more boring than the word workflow, but they're actually pedagogical choices. When you decide that the group formation will be based on the difference between people rather than the similarity, you change completely. You make a pedagogical decision. You decide to build on conflict resolution. So there is no technical choice in this time. All technical choices are pedagogical decision. That's very important to stress this. Now, what about the stochastics? Let's imagine that you have, so we have the graph here. For the simplicity, I put 3 activities, A1, A2, A3, and you have the state of the learner S at time 0, at time 1, at time 2, at time 3. Okay, so you can represent it like that in the graph, or like a simple thing here. What is the state? Well, it can be anything, but to make it simple, let's imagine that your learner can be in 4 states. Fine, everything okay. Active is not great, but it's still working. Lost, he seems to be doing not much, and drop is not there anymore. Okay. Imagine, to make it simple, that there are only 4 states to describe the learner. And we have a time series where at the end of activity you are able to capture the state of this learner. So now you guess where I am going. You will go and do a stochastic model of that. Now you will say, Pierre, these 4 states is very simplistic. I mean, education is better than this, right? You have in the educational research a lot of more sophisticated terminology to describe the state, like an impasse. I think it was the work of Kurt Van Leyen. When the learner is in an impasse, his knowledge does not allow it to solve the problem. That's a very good state, because then we can introduce new knowledge. So it's important to detect this cognitive state. Linear rigidity is people who've read Schoenfeld about when good math teachers are bad. If the learner has a very linear approach to a problem which is not linear, then it's interesting to detect the state. We have also state that describe the team leader, the team structure, whether there is groupthink, for instance. The team try to converge on any solution just because they want to finish and converge rather than to discuss, and so on. So we have a rich vocabulary, again, to describe what we mean by state. But for the simplicity, I will stay with a few states, these 4 states. So if we compare the change of state from Mr. S from one activity to the other one, we can represent as this state transition graph, where the probability, where let's say 39% of the students who are active are still active in the next one, 30% became fine, 17 dropped out, and 14 became less. So we can represent transition between 2 states before and after an activity by such a graph, or by the equivalent transition matrix. And this matrix is exactly the same as this graph, where we can compute then the entropy of each row, and which is knowing that John was lost at activity 1. What is the probability? What do I know about his state in activity 2? How much noise is there? How much entropy is there on this transition matrix? When I know the state here in an activity 1, how much uncertainty is there about the state in activity 2? And so we compute the entropy. I have the formula there, and then we normalize it by the number of states, because it is depending on the number of states. And then we compute the average entropy, and then we do 1, because that's maximal entropy, less this average entropy, this normalized entropy, and that gave us the weight of an edge. Heavy. Here you see that this weight is 0.10. It means that knowing the state of the learner in activity 1 does not tell you much about the activity 2. Now, the weight is not enough, because so the weight is 1 minus the normalized entropy. Because look at these 2 matrices. In this one, whatever you state is in activity 1, there are 75% chance that you will be fine in the next activity. In this transition matrix, which has exactly the same weight, the same entropy, whatever is your state in activity 1, you have 75% to be lost in activity 2. So these two matrices have the same entropy, but one is quite cool. I would say this is a very powerful learning activity, and this is very dramatic. The M6 is a very powerful learning activity. M7 is a very dramatic learning activity. So we have to measure that as well. So we have a formula that basically balances the green part over the red part, because the green is people who improve their state if we have a square matrix, and if the state are ordered from the least desirable to the most desirable. So the green half matrix is the people who improve the state, the red one is the opposite. So if I take this one minus this one minus this one, multiply by 2 because we're 2 rows away, by this one multiply by 2 because we're 2 rows away from the diagonal, and so on. Basically, we compute if the matrix balance on one side or on the other side. I call that the utopy of a matrix. It doesn't work, and it's not an English appropriate word, but I don't really care. It tells you, utopia would be a matrix where everybody is in the top right column. Okay, that's an utopia. It doesn't happen. I mean, human nature has diversity, but is why I call it entropy. Okay, now if you can then apply Markov chain and so on to this approach, the next step is the analytics. And it's not only analytics in MOOCs. Here we apply analytics to classroom by applying computer vision to compute the gaze direction of the students. Here we give them gadgets when they describe their state at any active exercise. So we also capture signals, the state of the learner in the real space. Now, let's imagine that at the end of activity 1, we have no clue about the state of the learner. We have a maximum uncertainty. And that at the end, then in the activity 2, these learner, so we have these 4 states. The learner has been watching a video, and he make many poses. What does it mean that he make many poses? Does it give us does it mean that he's very good? Well, we cannot say much about it. If he selects a correct answer in a quiz with some probability that he has understood that he is a fine state, but still he can choose it randomly. So the probability is the probability vector is a bit skewed, so the entropy decreased. But if the students send a message and say, "Oh, sir, there is a mistake on your slide," and blah blah blah, then it means a high probability that this guy is in a brilliant, or this person is in a brilliant state. So the diagnosis entropy is the way by which an activity of the learner, as it has been designed by the designer, allows you to reduce the entropy regarding to the state of the learner, whether the behavior reduces the entropy about the diagnosis. So if I summarize what I have done, I end up with a cube. This is a bit arrogant, maybe, I don't know, I apologize in advance. If this top right front corner of the cube is convergence of the 3 red arrows is a current state of the learner, Mr. SA, I can predict his state from his previous states, the horizontal line. That's what we've seen right now from the transition matrices, this axis. I can infer his current state from his current behavior, which is what we've just seen here, the diagnosis entropy. And finally, we can predict his state from the state of another learner. And this sounds a bit bizarre, but let's imagine that, let's say SA, I don't know his states. I have no idea about the, sorry, I have no idea about the transition matrix, because my matrix are not full, so I cannot use it. But I know that A at the previous activity was twice better, scored twice better than B. Then there is some probability that is still twice better than B at the time I, at the current time. This is not sure, of course. But if I have no information about the transition matrix, if I have no information about this behavior, then if I only based on this social axis, vertical is always social in this graph, then the best inference I can do is to use the social information. Now, if let's say I use eye tracking, and I see that the eye tracking of S should be B here. Sorry, the eye tracking the back right bottom BISA should be BISB. The number of fixation of student B was twice more than the number of case fixation of student A. Then I can use this difference to compare, to infer the current state of learner A from the current state of learner B, which is in this case known. And we can say that if for instance here, if the previous behavior of student A was to make no pause, and this was correlated to, now when the learner was making very many pauses in the video, for instance, it was related to a loss state. If the learner makes many pauses again in the video, we can also infer that the learner is lost. So we can use a 3 dimension of this cube for reasoning about the evolution, and we can even go second order, but let me skip that. So, and the last thing is about the more dynamic aspect and the orchestration. A workflow is not a flexible structure, while a pedagogical scenario must look like this. It's something that the teacher must be able to stretch, move, change, and reshape all the time. If you're a teacher, you know that if you don't adapt the scenario, you are dead. And a workflow is not a very flexible structure. So how can we encompass the flexibility in this orchestration graph? That's my last point. And by modeling the flexibility as a time evolution of the weight. So if one activity, for instance, is very prerequisite to the next one, is a strict prerequisite. Okay. So the probability, if you succeed A, you have a high chance to succeed B, or if you succeed A1, you have high chance to succeed A2. Actually, this probability is maybe true if you do it A2 after 60 minutes, but maybe less after 2 hours, and probably less after 3 weeks. So this weight actually decreases over time, and that's what we try to measure by the edge elasticity. And maybe I skip this to conclude. Yeah, so this is not a learning theory. I stress that, this modeling orchestration graph. In a learning theory, you explain that, for instance, students who have conflict will have higher gain because they will argue. So you have an effect, you predict an effect, and you give a causal explanation. Okay. An orchestration model is more, how will you operate this thing? How you will design a pedagogical scenario that is able to make conflicting pairs if you have 2,000 students. So it's more a design tool than a learning theory about how people learn. But the design anticipates the analytics. It's a design that takes into account from the beginning, then at the end we want to make analytics with that. And so in my lab, very often we kind of consider the analytics when things are finished, like 2 days before the experiment. We say, hey, what about the log file and so on. Here the idea is that the analytics will be embedded from the beginning in the design of the things by describing things in terms of activities, edges, operators, states, and so on. You can from the beginning embed the thinking analytics in the design. Okay, my last slide. I pretend, as a former school teacher, that this works. The way of looking at your own teaching works if you are a school teacher with 20 kids, as well as if you are a MOOC teacher with 20,000 people. About the MOOC with 20,000 people, this orchestration graph has not been implemented, so it's just an idea. About the class with 20 kids, if the teacher collects and distribute sheets of paper, these are operators. These are workflow operators that don't look like workflow in the computational sense, but collecting sheets, grading them, distributing them, asking students to situate. It's the same operators as in the theory. So yeah, I pretend that this way to describe pedagogical scenario applies to both face-to-face classes as well as online education. And as you can see, there is a book that came out and that described in details everything I told you today. And that's the end of my lecture, Olivier. I will deactivate the screen sharing.
Thank you very much, Pierre. And with the orchestration graphs, you're certainly addressing a very important aspect of education, online education, and also the MOOC space. First of all, before we start with a short discussion, everyone who's watching this live, you can submit your questions using the Q&A function of the Hangout. If you're watching on the YouTube channel, you have to go to the Hangout to submit your questions, and we're going to address them here in this in these last 20 minutes of this session. So maybe to kick off the discussion part, I have a question for you, Pierre. So you said this is the orchestration graphs are a conceptual framework, a theory, a way of introducing computational thinking in design. And if you actually want to implement orchestration graphs for large-scale education in MOOCs, so where in this MOOC ecosystem would you think it's most strategic to work on and an increasing adoption of this approach? So, for example, do you think the MOOC platform providers would be the ones who are supposed to enforce that the MOOC developers approach their MOOC development in a way that is consistent with your orchestration graphs? Or would it be on the side of the MOOC developers? Should we train the MOOC developers that they know about this way of thinking and about this way of designing their MOOCs? Or is it on the side of the researchers? So it's most strategic to adopt this framework as a research framework and then come up with best practices derived from this orchestration graph framework and pass those on to the developers of MOOCs. So where in this space would you see the next steps towards an adoption and implementation of these orchestration graphs in the MOOC space?
I would love the MOOC platform take some of the ideas. They don't need to buy anything. They could take. You have some echo. Did you switch off your sound? Okay. I would like to. I mean, I'm in very good contact. I've seen Coursera people today. I see edX people on Monday, so I'm in good contact with them. But I don't think they can implement this. I mean, they are overwhelmed by their success. They've so many technical constraints that I don't see. I'm not very optimistic. Maybe the smaller book platform that try to compete to beat the two main one could try to get some ideas to bypass the best one. I know that the FutureLearn, the British MOOC platform, use the word orchestration in their approaches. So that's not the most optimistic scenario. Another one would be to have to design an orchestration engine. So some kind of thing that can give service to the community. So any MOOC platform could send me, for instance, to my MOOC to my orchestration service, a list of 20,000 students, and ask me, Pierre, make pairs of people with conflicting opinion. Okay, so something that is just a middleware that provides services to existing platform, with some kind of business model to be invented. That maybe it would cost 10 francs to do these group formation algorithms. It's not completely crazy, because there is the standards, LTI and so on, to share data between MOOCs. But if I would have a few million, I will work on that, not on reinventing a MOOC platform, but rather to have an orchestration engine that can provide service to many MOOC platforms. The last approach that is kind of influence the thinking of the research community. That would be extremely arrogant for me to pretend that it will be the case. Of course, I would be delighted if it could influence the thinking of people. Currently, I have no clue, honestly, whether this is complete bullshit or whether it's a good theory. My point is that for the last 25 years in this field, computer scientists told me, Pierre, we cannot do much education, it's just blah, blah. There is no way to describe things in a clear and formal way. And I say, yes, a nice lesson is a graph. You can describe a nice lesson in a very formal way. So my point was maybe to bridge, I'm an education guy in a school of computer science, and my point was to provide a language by which computer scientists can understand education people. Simply because we make one step in describing, when you describe a lesson in terms of a graph with operators and states and transition between states, then you enter the world of computer scientists who might then say, and then in my book I stop there. I don't enter into the advanced computational model, the Bayesian networks and the POMDP, or I don't remember how you call them, this dynamic decision-based Markov stuff. So it's just the first step towards computer science, from which smarter people could take off and say, oh, if you can describe a lesson with this formal graph, then I might do something with that. So I hope this will happen. I'm not extremely optimistic. I have no clue.
Okay, so yeah, I also hope that this is going to happen. Maybe a question in a similar direction on the side of the instructors, typical instructors of MOOC. Okay, there's maybe not the typical instructor, but if you think about the kind of instructors you have seen in MOOCs, what would be is there anything you can identify that's missing in their knowledge that they would need to actually understand the way of this computational thinking? Is there a lack of computational thinking in the among instructors, among educators today, so they can benefit from this this theoretical framework in designing and their MOOC and doing their education?
Most professors don't have much pedagogical knowledge. Some of them intuitively are good teachers, but they don't have what we call explicit pedagogical knowledge. And I would say that top scientists, if you take a machine learning person who give a class on Markov chain, so he's completely in this Markov stuff, he will probably apply Markov chains to medical data, to weather forecast data, to financial stock market values, and so on. And I guess he will not think about viewing his own activity as a Markov chain. So, because very often I have many top scientists in my universities, and they don't view education as a science. They view education as a practice that you have been taught in some way, and you will teach in the same way. Maybe as an art, because apparently some people are much better than others, so it's kind of a talent, personal talent. Another, teaching is not viewed as a rational activity of taking a content, analyzing, decomposing, and basically teaching is not designed. So here what I propose is a different approach for instructional design. For most people, teaching is not designed. You just say, okay, I have a lesson on this, I will do the PowerPoint, instead of thinking, can I have a team activity and an individual activity and so on? So I think we are this is very far from practitioner. I don't think I would give this to practitioners, especially the mathematicians. They will kill me. If they read this book, it must be full of mistakes from the mathematical point of view. So they will kill me before doing that. No, so it's more a book for experts, either for scientists doing research, or maybe for some MOOC platform one day.
Okay, so we have a reader of your book here. Armin Weinberger says he is on the last 10 pages of your book, and here's a question: what you see the role of learning analytics in your approach? So, what do you think learning analytics, what is the role of learning analytics for your approach? That's his question.
And salut, Armin. The learning analytics, is it true that you have 10 pages left from my book? I might ask you some question about it to check this. Anyway, you must be the only one. And thank you for that. The idea of here is that I call this idea design for analytics. That when you design a pedagogical scenario, you anticipate the analytics at the time of design by describing this state, transition, and so on. And of course, when I mean design by analytics, the goal of the design is not analytics. The goal of the design is to design nice things that will help people to learn. But if you anticipate the thinking of analytics from the beginning, then my intuition, I have no proof of that, is that we will be able to do much more powerful analytics. Imagine you have a car engine, one of these polluting cars that you produce, Armin. Imagine you have, and you want to make analytics on vibration. So you measure vibration at 10 points of the engine, in the same way that I measure the state of the learner at the 10 points in the orchestration graph. Okay, if you want to make something with these 10 points of vibration data, you must know that one component was this part of the engine. The other component was the battery. This component was the I don't have the vocabulary, the piston. And you must know where you put your sensors, and all these different things connect to each other to understand how vibration propagates in your engine. So the same thing for me. If you want to make analytics on a pedagogical scenario, you must know where you plug your sensors and what they do and so on. That's the connection I see between analytics and the graph. So it's a graph that could hopefully make analytics more powerful. Again, it's an hypothesis, and this book is full of unproven hypotheses.
So one question that I had, you mentioned as one kind of sensor is also eye tracking as to get an idea of students' attention and what they're looking at. So I know that you're doing work on using a cheaper and widely available hardware for doing eye tracking. Could you imagine this also to play a role in the MOOC space and then be used as one sensor in the context of doing analytics in that space? Or how far are we away from using that? And what would the incentives be of students actually switching on their cameras for us doing analytics on that?
How far? I would say 6 months. So we make this cheap $99 eye tracker by dismantling the camera from a PlayStation, and we made it ourselves. But now you can buy these mobile eye trackers. They're very reliable. We did not continue producing them ourselves. But sooner or later, the webcam will provide, in 6 months, the webcam will provide reliable eye tracking. So what is the advantage? Well, we could measure in our MOOCs, when we use eye trackers, we could measure that the wizeness was predictive of learning gains. So the students, wizeness is whether the students follow the finger of the teacher on the screen, and his pen or his finger. We show the hand of the teacher on the tablet computer, and those who simply follow the finger do not learn better. But those who stay where the teacher points and read the information have higher learning scores. So what we've designed now is a technology where you don't embarrass too much the learner, but if you notice with an eye tracker that his wizeness is low, that he's not following the teachers very well, then you introduce some trick on the interface to focus his attention. So using webcams to do eye tracking while you watch MOOCs and predicting a loss of attention and having the MOOC platform reacting to that, yeah, a few months of work.
That sounds promising. I wouldn't have thought that it's that close to being able to use productively. So we're almost at the end of the hour, and I can't see any more questions submitted here. They will probably trickle in the discussion forums later. So if there are any more questions, then please submit them now. Otherwise, I want to thank you, Pierre, for taking the time out of your busy schedule, and it was, as always, a great pleasure. And I've heard a talk about orchestration graphs, your talk in Madrid before, and I was very impressed. So I was very happy that you were talking about this again here in our talk series. And so we are also in the final stages of finishing our discussion X blocks, so everyone who is listening, we will send out a notification in our Christmas newsletter soon. And the next talk in the Dance Talk series will most likely be in January, and this will also be announced in the next newsletter. So thank you, Pierre. Do you have any final words to the readers or prospective readers of your book?
Well, if you have comments, send me the comments, okay? And Armin, if you really finish the book, I pay you a beer.
I'm sure he will take you up on this.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
And see you next time. Bye.